Well, this is the point where we depart somewhat from our advertised schedule. If you were hoping for a talk on William Symington, and you've come especially, I'm afraid to disappoint. Though I did do, if you do really want a talk on William Symington, I did one on Zoom for the Scottish Reformation Society back in COVID days. So I think it's around YouTube somewhere. We will mention Symington, but we've got too many other Covenanter stories to cover, so we'll stay in the 17th century rather than jumping forward to the 19th. Now the psalm that we have just sung was sung by the Covenanter martyr Donald Cargill on the scaffold, and we're going to read now from Lamentations chapter 3. Lamentations chapter 3. There is an event in Cargill's life which we'll be looking at later on tonight, when he excommunicates King Charles II. And after he does that, he preaches from Lamentations 3, particularly from verses 31 and 32. For the Lord will not cast us off forever. So, at that point, the persecution had been going on for 25 plus years, and it maybe seemed like the Lord had cast his people off forever. The killings are getting more and more brutal and common and intense, but they had this hope that the Lord would not cast them off forever. And so we're going to read now from Lamentations 3, and we'll begin at verse 31 and go on down to verse 48. So Lamentations chapter 3, and we'll read from verse 31. For the Lord will not cast off forever, but though he cause grief, he will have compassion according to the abundance of his steadfast love. For he does not afflict from his heart or grieve the children of men. To crush underfoot all the prisoners of the earth, to deny a man justice in the presence of the Most High, to subvert a man in his lawsuit, the Lord does not approve. Who has spoken, and it came to pass, unless the Lord has commanded it? Is it not from the mouth of the Most High that good and bad come? Why should a living man complain, a man about the punishment of his sins? Let us test and examine our ways and return to the Lord. Let us lift up our hearts and hands to God in heaven. We have transgressed and rebelled, and you have not forgiven. You have wrapped yourself with anger and pursued us, killing without pity. You have wrapped yourself with a cloud so that no prayer can pass through. You have made us scum and garbage among the peoples. All our enemies open their mouths against us. Panic and pitfall have come upon us, devastation and destruction. My eyes flow with rivers of tears because of the destruction of the daughter of my people. And how relevant those words to the Covenanters in the 17th century. Well, if you've missed the first two talks, or even just by way of reminder, we began with Patrick Hamilton, the first martyr of the Scottish Reformation. William Tyndale's New Testament came out 500 years ago this year, and Patrick Hamilton's death was 2 years later. It's all part of the same work of God. St Andrews, where Patrick Hamilton was one of the Scottish cities that these Bibles that are being translated and printed on the continent, and they're being smuggled into Britain. And St Andrews is one of the places that they're coming. And then we looked at George Wishart, John Knox's inspiration. He is also martyred, but he doesn't let Knox go with him. He says one is sufficient for a sacrifice. In 1560, Reformation becomes a national reality in Scotland. Then under Andrew Melville, it moves on to the next stage as Presbyterianism is firmly established. But under the Stuart kings, starting with James VI and their belief in the divine right of kings, many of the gains of the Reformation begin to be undone. Despite Melville reminding King James that there are two kings and two kingdoms in Scotland, there's King James, but there's also King Jesus. But James doesn't listen. 1618 is a particularly bad year with the passing of the 5 Articles of Perth, which seem to the people to be a step back towards Catholicism. James VI dies in 1625 and is replaced by his son, Charles I, who continues and advances his father's religious policies. A new Book of Common Prayer is forced on the Church, but on the day that it comes into force in July 1637, Jenny Geddes throws her stool at the Dean of Edinburgh. Riots erupt and it leads to the signing of the National Covenant of Scotland. 5 years later, 1643, we have the Solemn League and Covenant signed not just by the Scottish Parliament but the English Parliament as well, and many thousands of people throughout the 3 kingdoms of Scotland, England and Ireland. It's a vision for preserving the Reformed Church of Scotland and bringing the churches of England and Ireland into line with the Word of God and the examples of the best Reformed churches. And for the next 17 years, there's lots going on. There's conflict between Cromwell down in England and the Scottish Covenanters. There's shock among the Scottish Covenanters as Charles I is executed by the English. There's division among the Covenanters, particularly in terms of their attitude to his son, Charles II, who's in exile, who the Covenanting nobles crown as king, making him the only British king to be crowned by Reformed Presbyterians. But on the whole, they are years of relative freedom for the Church. Years when people are being converted and well instructed in the faith. And we should really look at this time as one of revival, not simply of a change of church government or structures. There's a helpful paragraph in David Mackay's book, The Bond of Love, which I'll put on the screen here. He says it's often claimed... let me fix this PowerPoint. There, he says it's often claimed that national covenanting entails forcing Christian beliefs on unwilling citizens. In response, it may be pointed out that covenanting of this kind would only be possible in a context of a great movement of the Holy Spirit bringing national revival. Only then would rulers and citizens be in a position to make a true covenant response to the Lord. He goes on to point out that the laws of every nation reflect a particular religious outlook, even if it be only that of the secular humanism so prevalent in Western culture. Laws must embody some values. Christians must pray and work for the embodiment of biblical principles in national laws. National covenanting flowing from revival would simply acknowledge the only true lawgiver and judge, and the covenant people of God cannot settle for any lesser goal. So it's a time of revival and relative peace and freedom for the church. But from 1660, everything changes. The Covenanters didn't like Oliver Cromwell, but after he dies and his son proves unable to follow him, Charles II comes to the throne and 28 years of persecution begin. Key figures from the Second Reformation are hunted down and executed. James Guthrie, Samuel Rutherford, didn't quite manage to execute him, but they would have. Archibald Johnson, and the very man who had crowned Charles the Marquis of Argyll. The faithful ministers are driven from their churches if they won't bow to the king's authority in the church. And the people who go to hear them preaching in the fields are reported to the authorities and fined. The repression of the people gets worse and worse, culminating, as we saw last time, in an 8-week period of state-sponsored terrorism by the Highland host. Thousands of soldiers sent down to southwest Scotland in 1678. It's designed deliberately to try and provoke a response from the Covenanters so that they could be even more violently put down. Which does sort of work. In the month that follows, you have the assassination of Archbishop Sharp. We have the victory at Drumclog and the defeat at Bothwell Bridge. And we finished last time with those captured at Bothwell Bridge being imprisoned in the open air, hanged or sent towards Barbados, with many of them dying when the ship sank and the captain wouldn't open the hatches. So things were pretty bleak when we left them. So bleak, in fact, that the field preachers who are left and haven't been executed stop preaching in the fields. They think it's just too dangerous. And it's at this point that Richard Cameron starts preaching. Cameron would become known as the Lion of the Covenant. The early Reformed Presbyterians would be particularly associated with him and given the name Cameronians. But that was all in the future. When Cameron begins preaching, he focuses his preaching maybe too much on those ministers who had accepted the indulgences. He gets into a bit of trouble with some of the moderate Covenanters. And so he goes to Holland for a few months, where there were quite a few banished Scottish ministers. But they're impressed by Cameron, and they find that the reports from back home have been exaggerated. They ordain him, and they send him back to Scotland, pretty much knowing that he's going to be killed. One of them, a man called Robert McWard, said, "Richard, the public standard is now fallen in Scotland. And if I know anything of the mind of the Lord, you are called to undergo your trials before us. Therefore to go home and lift the fallen standard and display it publicly before the world. But before you put your hand to it, go to as many of the field ministers as you can find and give them your hearty invitation to go with you. And if they will not go, go alone, and the Lord will go with you." And aren't those stirring words even for us today? If they will not go, go alone, and the Lord go with you. Even if you're the only person in your family, the only person in your workplace, the only one seeking to honour the Lord. McWard then went on to make what you could call a prediction or a prophecy. After ordaining him, he lifted his hands off Cameron's head and said, "Behold, all ye beholders, here's the head of a faithful minister and servant of Jesus Christ, who shall lose the same for his master's interest, and shall be set up before sun and moon in view of the world." And Cameron isn't the only one being sent to his death. There are other ministers who know that if they go back to Scotland, they'll be killed. But they go anyway. Just as Patrick Hamilton had done at the First Reformation, and Knox had done, though of course Knox wasn't martyred, but he didn't know that at the time. It's a little bit like the German pastor Dietrich Bonhoeffer in the late 1930s, knowing that if he goes back to Germany on the eve of war under Nazi control, that he'll likely be killed. But he goes anyway. It was the same in the days of John Calvin, for that matter. People maybe think of Calvin just sitting around Geneva writing big tomes of theology. But he was also training missionaries to send them back to his native France, knowing that many of them would be killed. And even today, like people coming from a certain country to train for the ministry in America and then going back to their home country. They're probably not expecting death, but certainly hardship, and possibly interrogations and beatings like many of their brothers and sisters have faced. So Cameron returns to Scotland around the same time as Donald Cargill, who we'll think about next, and they convince one other minister to join them. And one of the most memorable things that the three of them would do would be in the town of Stranraer, where in June 1680, as representatives of the Covenanted Nation and Church of Scotland, they reject Charles II as king, and they protest against the prospect of his Catholic brother James II succeeding him as king. Now, obviously, that's pretty radical to say we don't recognise our king anymore. But here's the thing. It was exactly what Britain as a whole would do just 8 years later. Britain would reject James II as king when they declared the throne to be vacant and invited William of Orange and Mary to come in his place. And so the Cameronians are 8 years ahead of the nation here. And if someone were to say, well, they shouldn't have rejected the Stuart monarchy, they would have to say that the whole nation was wrong to do it within a decade. But obviously at this point it makes Cameron public enemy number one. Well, the next month, government troops would catch up with him and his brother Michael and 7 other Covenanters at Ayers Moss, a remote spot in Ayrshire. Before the battle, Cameron famously prays, "Lord, take the ripe and spare the green." And he and his brother were obviously among the ripe. They were obviously among those ready to be taken by the Lord, because they were killed while the others were taken prisoner. Cameron's body is buried basically just where he lay. Maybe some of you have been there at Ayers Moss. Alexander Peden, the prophet of the Covenanters, he visited there. Peden, who is known for going back between Scotland and Ireland frequently. And as Peden visited that grave site soon after Cameron's death, he lifted his eyes to heaven and he said about his friend, "Oh, to be wi' Richie." Cameron's head and hands were cut off and taken to Edinburgh, where his father Alan was in jail. And in an act of unspeakable cruelty, the soldiers brought his son's head and hands to him to ask him if he recognised them. And old Alan Cameron kissed them and said, I know them. They are my sons, my own dear sons. It is the Lord. Good is the will of the Lord, who cannot wrong me nor mine, but has made goodness and mercy to follow us all our days." What faith in the midst of great tragedy. Well, Cameron's funeral sermon is preached by Donald Cargill. He's the one whose sermon notes we started with last night, preaching in the fields about those who went out to look at Covenanter martyrs being hanged, but just doing it because they wanted to see a spectacle. Those who saw but didn't behold. Who was Donald Cargill? Well, I was asked last night in the interview about those who've most shaped and influenced me. And if you'd asked Donald Cargill the same question, one of his answers would undoubtedly have been Samuel Rutherford. Samuel Rutherford was one of those first Reformation leaders who we thought about this morning. His letters have been published and become a spiritual classic, but his book, Lex Rex, would have got him executed if he'd lived long enough. And Donald Cargill, in turn, at least in how he died, would be a big influence on a young James Renwick. So never underestimate the power of example. If you can influence even one person for good, who knows how God might use their influence and who God might use them to influence. So the Second Reformation leaders may be dead, but they influenced the next generation. And one of those they influenced was Donald Cargill. We also thought this morning about Charles II, and after Charles is restored to the throne, Cargill gets in trouble for preaching against the king and goes into hiding. Now, I said this morning about the Covenanter's dream of a covenanted king turning to a nightmare as Charles returns to Scotland and comes to the throne. Well, a year after his restoration, churches were meant to mark the occasion. And Cargill did mark it, but not in the way he was expected to. Here's what he said. He said, "We are not come here to keep this day upon the account for which others keep it. We thought once to have blessed the day wherein the king came home again. But now we think we shall have reason to curse it." We thought we were going to bless the day when a covenanted king came to take the throne of Scotland. But now it looks like we're going to curse that day instead. Now the authorities hear the sort of things that he's saying, and he has to go into hiding. But he keeps on preaching in the fields. There are many stories of Cargill's hair's breadth escapes. One time he's in a house and the troops come, and those in the house hide him in what must have been like a bay window, or at least a window with a good sized windowsill, and they cover it up with books. They just stack up books to hide him. And the soldiers come, they search the house. One even goes up to the attic and falls through the attic, whereas even if they just pulled out one book, they would have seen him. On another occasion, he's ambushed and his horse is shot from under him, but he escapes. After the victory at Drumclog, Cargill rushes to join those who'd come together at Bothwell Bridge, but he was badly wounded in the battle and left for dead. He survives, he goes to Holland for a while, and then comes back to Scotland to join Cameron preaching in the fields. After Cameron dies, Cargill, as I said, preaches his funeral sermon. And then at an enormous outdoor meeting at Torwood in September 1680, he excommunicates the king. Now that might seem like a futile gesture. It's not like the king's going to be too worried. But its logic is that the king is a member of the Covenanted Church of Scotland because he's sworn the covenants. And now he's killing Christians. And so he needs to be excommunicated. At the same meeting, Cargill excommunicates the Duke of York, who would soon come to the throne as James II, and some others. It's really a who's who list of the most notorious persecutors of the church. Now, Cargill already has a price on his head, but at this point the price is raised to 5,000 merks, which today would roughly be between 60 and 80,000 pounds. So as you can imagine, there are a lot of people who are keen to try and catch him. And eventually, the following summer, he is caught and he's tried for treason. Cargill, who had just weeks before preached about those who would go out to see martyrs hanged just for the spectacle, would now himself be hung. And predictably, almost routinely, by this point, his head is cut off and put on public display. And yet Cargill's execution proved to be a bit different from those he had warned about just a few weeks earlier of people seeing them and being unmoved by them. because people were moved by Cargill's execution. The combination of dignity and utter conviction that he exuded during his final minutes deeply moved the spectators, and in particular the 18-year-old James Renwick, who subsequently assumed Cameron's mantle. Renwick, we could say, he saw Cargill executed, but he also beheld something deeper. Cargill had said in that sermon a few weeks before, "Many sees, but few beholds." That is to say, a great multitude is seeing the justice of men executed, but there are few that are beholding the holiness of God that is wronged in regard of his Godhead. But Renwick beholds the holiness of God being wronged as Cargill is executed for sticking to the Bible. And Renwick will take up the fallen mantle. We'll come back to Renwick shortly, but we'll move on now from ministers for a while and focus on some of the ordinary people, one of whom was John Brown. John Brown lived on a farm called Priest Hill. Again, like Skake Hill this morning, that site of the huge communion, Priest Hill is a pretty remote site to get to. I've only ever had reason to open the Compass app on my phone one time, and that was to try and find this grave, because it's not as if there's a signposted path that you can follow to get to these places. Well, as he was growing up, John Brown heard the teaching of some of the banished ministers, and it held him in good stead, and he in turn passed on what he had learned to others. Every Monday night, John Brown met with young people who came from miles around and instructed them from the Bible and the confession of faith. In the summer, they'd do it in basically a sheep pen. In the winter, they'd sit round the fire that was in the middle of his floor in his very basic house. We're also told in the accounts that John Brown was helped in this by two other men, David and William Steele. I said last night that if we don't keep up the memory of the Covenanters, who else will? And if someone else was speaking to you about John Brown, they might not mention these two Steele men, but you know, if I don't keep up the memory of great Steeles of the past. Well, anyway, John Brown married Isabel Weir. They were married by Alexander Peden. We've mentioned him already this evening. And during those days when there were no ministers preaching in the fields, God's people began to meet together as what they called the United Societies. The United Societies, it was an organisation, basically a way of answering the question, what does an illegal underground church look like? How does it function? They weren't claiming to be a church as such, but they were keeping in touch, and they were basically a network of local small group society or fellowship meetings. And one of these United Society meetings was held at Priest Hill, and they made a contribution to send a young man to Holland as part of his training for the ministry. And the young man's name was James Renwick. Now, for his involvement in these sort of things, John Brown soon became a wanted man. And the day of his martyrdom was the 1st of May, 1685. Brown and his nephew were cutting peat when the arch-enemy of the Covenanters, John Graham of Claverhouse, and his dragoons, his soldiers, they suddenly appeared and seized him. By this point, Charles II had died, only to be replaced by his Roman Catholic brother James. And under James II, the persecution got even worse, if that can be imagined. The years 1685 to 88 were known as the killing times, when not just ministers, but many of the ordinary people were killed because of their love for Jesus Christ. John Brown refused to take an oath denouncing the Covenanters, His house was searched, and Claverhouse found weapons and incriminating evidence. Claverhouse told his soldiers to shoot Brown, but they refused, and Claverhouse then did it himself in front of his wife and children. Claverhouse then asked Brown's wife, now his widow, "What thinkest thou of thy husband now, woman?" To which she replied, "I thought ever so much good of him, and as much more now than ever." And in Claverhouse's official report of the killing, he wrote, "I caused shoot him dead, which he suffered very unconcernedly." His trust was in Jesus Christ, so he had no fear of death. And that brings us just 10 days later to the killing of the two Margarets at Wigtown. Sandra was telling me earlier about a day trip that was organised back maybe in the 70s, that maybe some of the rest of you were on, when a tour bus came over to Stranraer and then on to Wigtown, where Ted Donnelly preached a sermon at the Martyrs' stake. Well, here's the story of why that stake is there. A man called Gilbert Wilson had 3 children, at least 3 that we know of. He and his wife attended the local state-approved church, but his children refused to. Their names were Margaret, Thomas, and Agnes. They were 18, 16, and 13. Now, because they didn't attend the local church, an arrest warrant was issued for them, and they had to leave home and live in the mountains and the open air. Their father was held responsible, even though he went to the local parish church that he was expected to go to. But he was heavily fined by the courts, and he had soldiers stationed at his house. Well, early in 1685, Charles II dies, and with his death, persecution slackens for a time. And in February, Margaret and Agnes, the sisters, they go to Wigtown to see one of their friends, the 63-year-old Margaret McLaughlin. But they are betrayed, they're arrested, they're found guilty of attending illegal conventicles, and they're sentenced to be drowned. And it's interesting, in one of those Donald Cargill sermons I mentioned earlier that is preached before this point, he talks about people being drowned. So it's obviously not a reference to the two Margarets, but it does tell us that this happened in other places as well. So they're sentenced to be drowned. Their father Gilbert goes to Edinburgh to appeal the sentence. And given her young age, he was able to pay £100 to get Agnes released. Obviously, that was a lot of money in those days. But on the 30th of April, he also managed to get a stay of execution granted for his daughter and the other Margaret. But for some reason, the execution went ahead. Maybe the stay of execution was overturned. Maybe it was ignored. But on the 11th of May, 1685, the two Margarets are tied to stakes in the Solway Firth. Margaret McLaughlin was tied further out so that the younger Margaret might see her drown and recant her beliefs. When the water came over the older lady, they asked Margaret Wilson what she thought of her. And the 18-year-old Margaret said, "I see Christ in one of his members wrestling there. Do you think that we are the sufferers? No, it is Christ in us." She then sang part of Psalm 25, the psalm we plan to look at tomorrow morning, God willing. And then, with a great deal of cheerfulness, read Romans chapter 8. After reading it, she prayed, and as she was praying, the waters came up over her. Before she drowned, they pulled her up and asked her if she would pray for the king. And she answered that she wished the salvation of all men and the damnation of none. Someone in the crowd shouted out, "Dear Margaret, say, God save the king, say, God save the king." She answered, God save him if he will, for it is his salvation that I desire. And at this her relatives cried out, she said it, she said it. At which the soldiers gave her the chance to swear an oath disowning her beliefs. But she said, I will not. I am one of Christ's children. Let me go. At that point, one of the soldiers said, well, take another drink then, and pushed her under. Like John Brown just 10 days before, and others we've thought of, the two Margarets, they didn't set out to be heroes or to be remembered in our day. They were simply trying to live for Christ in their day, as we are called to do in ours. Well, we'll come back now to think about James Renwick. When we left him, he'd been sent to Holland by the United Societies to be licensed as a minister. Renwick was 18 years old when he saw or beheld Donald Cargill being hanged. Cargill's death meant there were no field preachers left. But Renwick threw his lot in with the United Societies. He went to Holland, and like so many others we've thought about over the last 2 days, came back to Scotland to preach, knowing that it would cost him his life. Renwick's sermons and letters, which you can buy and read, have been described as having a sharp-edged but warm devotion to Christ as sole king of his church. A warm devotion to Christ as sole king of his church. And so as the only field preacher, Renwick was in much demand. In 1 year he baptised 600 babies, which, as we thought about this morning, would have come with a very real cost to their families, by them choosing not to get their babies baptised by approved ministers, and the questions and inquiries that would lead to. Like Cargill, Renwick has a number of hair's breadth escapes before finally being captured at the end of January 1688 and hanged 2 weeks later. He was the last of the Covenanter martyrs to be publicly executed. Within a year, the cause for which he died was vindicated, as James II was removed from the throne of Britain to be replaced by William and Mary. But before that, still more would die, including the final individual we'll look at today, George Wood. James Renwick is often called the last of the Covenanter martyrs, and certainly he was the last to be publicly executed. But in fact, the last of the martyrs wasn't a preacher, but a 16-year-old boy called George Wood. In June 1688, George Wood was shot in a field near Sorn simply because he was known to be a Covenanter. He was shot in cold blood without any attempt at arrest or trial. And when he was challenged about it later, the trooper who did it said that he knew him to be a Covenanter and they were to be killed wherever they were to be found. Certainly it was the killing times. But in the same month, James II's wife gives birth to a son, and the prospect is there now not just of a one-off Catholic king, but of a succession of Catholic kings. And at this point, the rest of the nation does what the Covenanters had already done and rejects the Stuart kings. Well, just quickly to bring things up to the present day, the Covenanters who had flocked to hear Cameron, Cargill and Renwick were of course deeply grateful and thankful to God that the persecution had come to an end. But they were deeply disappointed with the Revolution's settlement. The covenants were ignored, indulged ministers and even persecutors were accepted into the new church. There was still some level of state control of the church even in Scotland. South of the border, William was head of an Episcopal Church of England in breach of the covenant. And so the United Societies would continue on without ministers until they eventually got one in 1706. A first presbytery is formed in 1743, and the Synod of the Reformed Presbyterian Church of Scotland is formed in 1811. One of its members, a ruling elder, is the father of William Symington, who just over 200 years ago became minister in the RP Church in Stranraer. And he did much in his day to promote the memory of the Covenanters, as we thought about way back at the beginning on Friday night. In fact, he's been described as the penman of the Scottish Covenanters. And one interesting connection between Symington and those we've been thinking about tonight is that after 20 years he left Stranraer, he went to Glasgow, where he was preaching in a building that held 1,000 people, and it was frequently full. As soon as they opened the doors, it would just fill up like that. But as well as meeting publicly in their huge numbers, they maintained the Covenanter practice of the small group fellowship meetings. And one of the fellowship meetings associated with his congregation in Glasgow, we're told, had been meeting continuously since the days of the Second Reformation and the National Covenant. So Symington, 200 years on from the Covenanters, sought to apply their legacy in his day. Just as we, a further 200 years on, seek to do in our day. And just in conclusion to the historical part of this weekend, let me just point out that the word martyr in the Bible is a word that originally meant witness. Some Bible versions will translate it as witness in some places and martyr in some places. Others will just be consistent and translate it as witness everywhere. But that word witness, it came to mean what we think of as a martyr, because so many of the Christians in the early church were being killed for their faith. To witness simply became known as to be killed. So are we all called to be martyrs today in the sense of dying for Christ? No, not physically at least, though some of our brothers and sisters in Christ around the world are. But we are all called to be witnesses and seek to be faithful to Christ in our day, just as the Covenanters were in their day. Whatever the spiritual state of the nation around us, and whatever the cost. And if others won't go with us, we will go alone. Amen.